My name is Paul Shelley, and welcome to TheAstroHistorian. This is a channel dedicated to exploring and explaining the lore of sci-fi and space universes and discussing their impact. Today we'll be discussing what I believe is the most important event in the lore of Starfield, the Colony War. But before we get started, I wanted to let you know that if you want me to cover more Starfield lore, be sure to like the video and hit the subscribe button. It's been awesome seeing new folks watch my early Starfield videos, and if you all still like them, I will keep making them alongside my other videos. With that all said, let's talk about the pivotal event in the history of Starfield. To start off, this isn't an exhaustive video into the Colony War, as I would prefer to let y'all explore the game and find out more about the conflict on your own. We might do a more exhaustive video in the future once the game is settled a little bit. As a result, this is just meant as a primer to better understand the conflict, as I believe that understanding the Colony War is the most important factor in understanding the state of the settled systems in 2330, when the game takes place. The Colony War is going to require a bit of context though, as the events that led to it are actually the result of a separate conflict, one that directly led to the conditions of the war. In fact, I'd argue that the Colony War is actually the continuation of the first conflict, known as the Narian War. The Narian War started in 2194, when the United Colonies placed a station, known as the Clinic, in orbit of Deepla in the Narian system. This was done without the consent of the residents of Narian, who were independent from any faction. These residents believed that this was a deliberate attempt to expand the UC's sphere of influence into their system. So the people of Narian demanded the UC remove the station. The UC didn't seem to think that this was much of an issue, and they refused the request, stating it was just a medical station. This refusal pushed the people of Narian to vote to become a member of the Freestar Collective, in order to return their sovereign control to the system. The Freestar Collective accepted the system into their alliance and mobilized their fleet to protect the Narian a year later in 2195. In response, 1 year later, the UC mobilized its own fleet to take into the Narian system. Thus began the Narian War. It's clear from the onset that neither side was prepared for a war like this to happen, as it took some time for both sides to mobilize and deploy their fleets into the system. For this reason, it's likely it never escalated beyond Narian, as it seems neither side possessed a large military at the time. Add to this the fact that this conflict took decades to wage seems to point to the reality that no one expected a conflict like this to erupt, and both sides were learning as they went. As the war dragged on, it became increasingly unpopular with both sides. However, it seemed that likely the superior industrial capacity of the UC was slowly turning the war in their favor. Given how undeveloped the Freestar Collective is, even today in 2330, it's not hard to see that the longer the war dragged on, the harder it would be for them to replace equipment and ships and soldiers, unlike the UC, who had a much easier time at this. Thus, the war would finally come to an end in 2216, when the UC finally destroyed the Freestar fleet in the system. Without a major fleet to defend its own systems, the Freestar Collective faced a real possibility of an unpopular war spiraling into an invasion of their territories and the entire destruction of their government. The UC, on the other hand, was in no position to invade anything. They were waging a war that was very unpopular and needed a way out. This defeat of the Freestar fleet gave them that opportunity, and were able to force the Freestar Collective to come to the bargaining table, and sign what would become known as the Treaty of Narian. The Treaty of Narian was surprisingly good to the Freestar Collective, who would retain control of the Narian system, and both sides agreed to limit their own claims to 3 star systems. However, it's my belief that while this seemed magnanimous for the UC, it was likely a long-term diplomatic strategy. First of all, the UC was in a very delicate situation. None of their own people wanted to continue the war, and them looking like the good guys would give them a popularity boost at home. Secondly, the Freestar Collective was still very new and didn't have the infrastructure nor the bureaucratic systems that the UC had. Thus, boxing in themselves made them look magnanimous, but was quite likely a diplomatic move to try to starve the Freestar Collective out, a futuristic version of the US tactic of containment during the Cold War. Box in your opponent and watch them crumble under their own weight. This theory of mine gets a little bit more credence when, over 90 years later in 2307, the Freestar Collective began farming on the planet of Vesta in the Lunara system. It's quite clear this was an attempt at expanding its own agricultural production capabilities, likely in order to relieve food stress on their own systems. Seeing this in 2308, the United Colonies claimed this was a violation of the terms of the Treaty of Narian. While both sides attempted to negotiate, the Freestar Collective claimed the system was not under their control, simply their farming operations were. The UC, on the other hand, seemed to push the Freestar Collective to abandon their farming operations, something that Freestar wasn't willing to do. It seems that both sides had learned the lessons of the Narian War and were far more willing to engage in brinkmanship, as both had developed new technologies, ships, and other terrible weapons of war. In the interwar period, both sides had developed large, capable combat fleets, but more importantly, they developed new means to wage war on the ground as well. It seems that perhaps the Freestar Collective was the first to create what is known as the Combat Mechanized Platform, also known simply as mechs. These giant walkers were incredibly devastating in combat, and while the UC would develop their own mechs, the Freestar Collective became specialists in mech warfare. However, mechs weren't the only new weapons to emerge from this time. Since 2306, the UC had been secretly developing their own Xeno Warfare Division, a group of scientists and military personnel dedicated to turning the alien life forms found in the settled systems into weapons. These Xeno weapons were effectively enhanced and mind-controlled beasts who could be released on an enemy as a force multiplier. In fact, the head researcher in Xeno Warfare Division compared it to the Manhattan Project in its importance to deciding the next war. Talks broke down in 2308 as both sides mobilized their forces, but the UC seemed confident in their chances of victory. They quickly moved their forces to Vesta and brutally slaughtered the Freestar forces on the surface and any reinforcements sent to relieve the beleaguered defenders. During their fight for Vesta, the UC dropped all of their latest gear, including mechs and the first generation of Xeno warfare creatures, known as the Stalkers. This crustacean-like species is native to the moon of Crete, and were modified to follow the commands of its handlers, known as the UC Red Devils. The battle was so one-sided that by the time the UC claimed victory in Vesta, the Freestar Collective forces had suffered an astounding 93% casualty rate, meaning the defenders were entirely overmatched in this initial engagement. In fact, the massacre at Vesta was repeated over and over throughout the settled systems, none more poignant than in the system of Narian. There, the UC quickly invaded and gained control of the critical planet of Nera, likely the main settled hub of the system. This marked the first time a member system of the Freestar Collective had been taken by hostile force, and the Freestar forces were determined to take it back. What would transpire from there is one of the great tragedies of the Colony War, the Battle of Nera. The Freestar Collective sent wave after wave of troops to the surface and ships to the orbit of the planet. The clash of soldiers, mechs, xenoweapons, and ships devastated large swaths of the world and became the graveyard of the pride of both the UC and the Freestar Collective. In order to better support the front lines of this ongoing conflict, the UC built a forward operations supply hub in the Ptolemy system on the planet of Ptolemy II. This hub attracted civilians as well as military personnel and would lead to the creation of the city of Londinian. At some point in the war, a terramorph infestation arose in the settlement. This invasion of terramorphs became unstoppable, ripping through the defenses of Londinian. The situation grew so dark that UC Admiral Francois Sanon ordered the bombing of the spaceport to prevent terramorphs from stowing away on fleeing ships and risk the species spreading throughout UC space. Afterwards, the UC sealed off the city, trapping everything remaining inside, including a large portion of the civilian population who were left at the mercy of the terramorphs. By 2311, the UC had managed to push into the capital system of the Freestar Collective, Cheyenne, and were bearing down on the capital planet of the Freestar Collective itself, Aquila. In a last-ditch effort, the Freestar Collective gathered all of the ships it could, including a large contingent of civilian ships, and proceeded to wage a hit-and-run campaign against the larger and better-equipped UC fleet. This death by 1,000 cuts approach seemed to have worked, as soon all of the UC's major ships had been damaged or destroyed, rendering the entire invasion fleet null and delivering a decisive victory for the Freestar Collective. The Battle of Cheyenne would bring both sides to the negotiation table once more. The 3 years of war were some of the most brutal and destructive mankind had ever waged, and it seemed both sides wanted a return to peace. In the following negotiations, what would become known as the Armistice, revolved around the size of both sides' military forces and the new weapons of war both sides had developed. They both agreed to limit the size of their military forces in order to prevent another arms race that would threaten the systems once more. They also agreed that both xeno-warfare and mechs were to be banned. A new facility was to be built on New Atlantis, known as the Armistice Archives, where all the information both sides had gathered about these new weapons of war was to be housed in case of an emergency when they may be needed again. This leads us to 2330, the beginning of the game, where the legacy of the Colony War is still being felt very visibly in the settled systems. The reduced militaries of both sides meant that factions like the Crimson Fleet, Ecliptic Mercenaries, House Varun Zealots, and Spacers are all operating unchecked in most places. The UC, having reduced capacity to keep the peace, turned to a new civilian-based militia system called the Vanguard to fill the gaps, offering civilians the chance to earn citizenship in the UC if they completed a tour with this new service. Meanwhile, research facilities, manufacturing plants, and more strewn about the systems that had been evacuated during the bloody Colony War are now hideouts for the nefarious factions of the systems, while the bioweapons of the UC seem to have escaped during the war and began terrorizing local populations of native creatures and inhabitants. Even the decaying hulks of destroyed mechs are being scavenged and sold on the black market. A generation of humans now sits in the shadow of this war, many communities devastated, homes destroyed, and families torn apart. A bitter resentment still lingers between the peoples of the Freestar Collective and the United Colonies, one not easily brushed aside. The settled systems are a shell of their former selves, weakened by devastating war. The political situation between the two major powers still remains tense, and all of this makes it even more dangerous for the likes of groups like Constellation and the player, who have to deal with all manner of hostile forces while attempting to unravel the mysteries of the universe. I'd like to thank you for watching this video. As always, let me know in the comments if you're interested in learning something specific from the Starfield universe or any other universe. If you really enjoyed what you watched, think about becoming a Patreon like those on screen now to help make future videos possible. Patreons get early, ad-free access to all videos and a special rank on the Discord. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, remember, ex historia ad astro.